It was the summer of 1897 in the small town of Brookhaven, Missouri. The days were long and unbearably hot, the nights heavy with silence, broken only by the song of crickets and the occasional howl of a stray dog echoing through deserted dirt roads. Life in Brookhaven moved at an unhurried pace. Farmers worked their fields from sunrise to sundown, children played barefoot in the dust, and women gathered on porches to exchange whispers about husbands, neighbors, and local gossip. On the surface, all seemed ordinary, even peaceful. Yet beneath that veil of small-town calm, something far darker was taking shape. His name was Samuel Whitlock. To most, he was just another boy, frail, pale-skinned, with eyes far too large for his thin face. He was only 14, but he carried a resting expression that unsettled people. An almost permanent smile etched across his lips. It wasn't a friendly smile, the kind that came with warmth or mirth. No. Samuel's smile felt like something carved into his face, cold and unchanging, as though it belonged to someone who knew things others did not. Neighbors would often whisper quietly after seeing him pass by, walking in silence along the edge of the cornfields, his small figure framed by rustling stalks, his lips curled upward in that unsettling curve. At first, no one gave him too much attention. In towns like Brookhaven, every family had its peculiarities, its black sheep, its outcasts. But Samuel wasn't just odd. There was something heavier about him, a presence that lingered after he left. The kind that made adults lock eyes with one another and murmur, "There's something wrong with that boy." Samuel lived with his mother in a crumbling farmhouse on the outskirts of town. His father had been gone for years. Some said he deserted the family, others whispered he died in a bar fight. The truth was never fully known, and no one pressed too deeply. What everyone could see, however, was that Samuel's home life was as fractured as the peeling paint on their porch. His mother, Martha Whitlock, was a tired woman who spent her days keeping the house from falling apart, and her nights trying to quiet the strange moods of the boy she was raising alone. Teachers described Samuel as intelligent, but distracted, always staring out the schoolhouse window, sketching crude images of knives and blood in the margins of his papers. When classmates asked him why he drew such things, he only tilted his head, maintaining that disarming grin, and answered with a voice disturbingly calm, "Because it feels right." The first signs of his cruelty began with animals. Small things disappeared around Brookhaven: a neighbor's cat, a dog too trusting of strangers, chickens stolen from a yard. People assumed coyotes or foxes were to blame, but the truth was far more chilling. Behind the Whitlock barn, in the tall weeds where children rarely wandered, Samuel practiced his own quiet rituals, the slow dissection of life. His hands steady and curious, blood staining the dirt beneath his shoes. And though his victims never spoke, those who saw him afterward, wiping his hands on his trousers, swore that his smile seemed sharper, wider, as though feeding on the horror of what only he had witnessed. No one, at that point, could yet imagine where this darkness would lead. In 1897, crime was not something Brookhaven knew well. Fights in saloons, yes. The occasional robbery, sure. But murder, especially of the kind that leaves a mark on history, seemed unimaginable in their quiet corner of Missouri. Yet in the weeks that followed, the town would learn that Samuel Whitlock's smile was not just an oddity. It was a warning. The first killing came suddenly, and to this day it is remembered less for the act itself than for the look on Samuel's face when it was discovered. Late in June, the body of 11-year-old Thomas Green was found near the edge of the woods behind the churchyard. His throat had been cut, his chest marred with deep, deliberate incisions. Father O'Connell, the parish priest, discovered the boy at dawn. His small body laid with an almost ritualistic care, his arms folded across his chest. The sight alone was enough to chill even the most hardened men in Brookhaven. But what unsettled them most wasn't the brutality. It was the detail that surfaced later, whispered by children who had been with Samuel the evening before. They claimed he had been smiling wider than usual, following Thomas with his eyes as the group played tag in the fields. He didn't laugh, one of them recalled. He just smiled, like he already knew something was going to happen. Suspicion landed quickly on Samuel, but with so little concrete evidence, and given his young age, the townsfolk hesitated. How could a boy barely 14 commit something so evil, so calculated? Parents kept their children closer in the days that followed, locking doors before sundown, whispering theories no one dared discuss too loudly. Yet Samuel walked through town as though nothing had changed, that same unfaltering grin painted across his face, his eyes following everyone closely, noticing their fear. The sheriff questioned him, of course. Sitting at the wooden desk inside the station, Samuel answered politely, calmly. He insisted he was innocent, that he had only been playing like everyone else. He even managed to force a laugh, though it sounded hollow, unnatural, rehearsed. When asked if he'd seen Thomas that night, he leaned forward, his lips stretching just a little wider, and answered softly, "I see lots of people. Some of them I never forget." The sheriff, unsettled, released him. Without proof, and with public pressure rising to catch the real killer, the trail grew cold. But the people of Brookhaven never truly doubted. Deep down they knew the unthinkable truth. Samuel Whitlock had killed Thomas Green, and worse, he had enjoyed it. It was only the beginning. The town didn't realize it yet, but Brookhaven was about to drown in fear. Each passing week, the boy with the chilling smile would grow bolder, his crimes escalating from curiosity to cruelty to horror. The name Samuel Whitlock would soon carve itself into Missouri's history, not simply as a murderer, but as a boy who smiled while killing, and when the next victim appeared, no amount of whispers, prayers, or locked doors could keep the darkness from spreading. The discovery of Thomas Green's body shook Brookhaven like nothing before. In a town where children ran freely through fields and mothers trusted their little ones to wander until sundown, a new heaviness settled. Fear seeped into daily conversation. At the general store, whispers carried over sacks of flour and bolts of fabric. Who could have done such a thing, and why? At church, Father O'Connell's sermons turned darker, the words "evil in our midst" repeated with more urgency each Sunday. But the quiet consensus, though rarely spoken bluntly, was already circling back to Samuel Whitlock. The boy had always been odd, yes, but something about him now seemed downright sinister. He still strolled through town with that pale, bony frame, his small boots kicking up dust along the dirt road. And that smile, that same frozen curve, seemed to grow more haunting under suspicion. When others lowered their eyes, Samuel raised his. He looked at people differently, as if he wasn't merely noticing them, but dissecting them piece by piece. Behind his glassy stare, parents began to pull their children closer whenever his shadow appeared on the street. Windows shuttered earlier than usual. A dog barked in the night, and families jolted awake imagining Samuel's grin just beyond the glass. The sheriff, Elias Turner, felt the pressure mounting. He was a man in his 50s, weathered from years of tending fields before working in law enforcement. But nothing he had seen, no drunken brawl, no bandit raid on a nearby farm, compared to the mutilation of young Thomas. Turner himself could not ignore what so many already suspected. Yet the law was a cage he was bound by, and suspicion alone could never lock Samuel away. So he watched him. Quietly, Turner asked neighbors where Samuel went at night. He noted the boy's odd behavior at school, kept a close eye whenever Samuel loitered near town square. But Samuel seemed aware of the scrutiny, because he left no evidence, only lingering unease wherever he stepped. One evening, under the fading glow of gas lamps, the sheriff spotted Samuel sitting alone at the edge of the creek. The boy held a stick, dragging it lazily across the water's surface. When Turner approached, boots sinking into the muddy bank, Samuel didn't flinch. He didn't even turn to look. Instead, with his back facing the sheriff, he spoke softly, almost as if reciting a thought. "You all think I killed him." The sheriff stopped short, thrown off by the boy's calm, matter-of-fact tone. "Why would you say that, son?" Turner asked. Finally, Samuel lifted his gaze from the water, slowly tilting his head to reveal that ever-present grin. "Because you're right." Then, after a long pause, he added through clenched teeth, "But you'll never prove it." Turner's blood ran cold. Was it a confession, a taunt, or nothing more than cruel imagination? Samuel only stood, brushed dirt from his trousers, and walked away, leaving the sheriff paralyzed on the creek's edge, wondering if he had just been mocked by a boy who knew himself untouchable. The town's unease soon turned to panic when another child went missing. 9-year-old Abigail Monroe failed to return home one cloudless afternoon in July. Her mother searched frantically, rushing from one neighbor's yard to another, her cries echoing through the fields. Soon half the town was out with lanterns, combing the woods, sweeping through barns, shouting her name into the growing night. It was past midnight when they found her. Abigail's small body was discovered deep in the fields, hidden between rows of tall corn. The cuts on her arms and face echoed those on Thomas Green. Her blood had soaked into the earth, forming dark stains that the farmers would remember every time they tilled that soil. What truly sickened those who found her was not just the violence, but the precision. There was intention in each wound, a disturbing patience carried out by hands too disciplined for any accident of rage. Whoever committed these murders did so with control, and just like before, suspicion rose instantly to Samuel. Whispers no longer stayed whispers. Mothers wept into their hands at the mention of his name. Fathers gathered at night in hushed meetings, debating what action they could take if the law refused to protect them. Some wanted to drive Samuel out of Brookhaven altogether. Others spoke with a darker edge, suggesting he deserved a more final consequence. But outwardly, Samuel appeared untouched by the storms circling him. Days after Abigail's funeral, the boy was seen standing near her family's home. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't acknowledge the grieving Munros, but neighbors swore they saw him watching, his lips turning up into that smile, his eyes tracing their tears as though savoring every drop. One older woman, Mrs. Dowell, claimed she confronted him. She approached with fury in her step and grief in her voice, asking him outright if he had done it. Samuel's response was chillingly casual. He leaned close enough for her to smell the iron on his breath and whispered, "Why ask me when you already know?" The story spread like wildfire after that, transforming the town's fear into something darker, dread. Brookhaven was no longer just afraid of Samuel Whitlock. They were convinced he enjoyed their fear. His presence was no longer simply unsettling. It was threatening, and still Samuel was untouchable. Turner had no evidence, no witnesses beyond terrified children too shaken to stand before the law. Samuel couldn't be tried on instinct alone, so the boy remained in Brookhaven, free to walk its dusty roads, his smile a taunt against an entire community paralyzed by terror. The summer dragged on, each sunset bringing new anxiety over who might vanish next. Parents no longer permitted their children to play freely in fields or woods. Farmers carried shotguns, not just for predators, but for the shadow of a boy they believed to be the true predator in their midst. And through it all, Samuel walked quietly, that smile never leaving his face, even as parents pulled their children behind them, even as grown men crossed to the other side of the road, even as shutters closed when he passed by. Some said he was broken from birth. Others believed the absence of his father and the harsh life with his mother had twisted him into a creature incapable of empathy. But the truth was even simpler. Samuel enjoyed what he did. He wanted people to know he enjoyed it. And the cruelty within him hadn't reached its peak. It was only sharpening. By the end of that summer, Brookhaven would no longer be counting missing children in whispers. They would be counting the dead aloud. And Samuel, the boy who smiled while killing, was just getting started. By late July, the murders of Thomas Green and Abigail Munro had tightened Brookhaven into a fist of paranoia. Families barricaded homes at night. Fathers patrolled porches with rifles balanced across their knees, and children were forbidden to venture farther than their own front yards. Yet despite all measures, fear remained a constant companion, because somewhere out there was Samuel Whitlock, and nothing seemed to stop him. When people passed him on the street, they avoided his eyes but could feel them anyway, boring into them with a quiet intensity. His smile never faltered, and every tilt of his head seemed to suggest he knew the secrets they whispered in the dark, the plans they made in hushed voices. He was a boy among them, but he was no child. Brookhaven began to see him as something else, not a predator like the coyotes in the fields, but a sickness that walked in human form, wearing a smile too big for his face. The cruelty of his crimes carried a rhythm, one that hinted at deliberate timing. Weeks separated each killing, and it was always a child. The wounds matched. The staging matched. These were not random acts. They were part of something carefully constructed, though no one could understand why. Sheriff Turner studied what little evidence he could scrape together. He drew marks and notes on a worn ledger late into the night at his desk, candles burning low as sweat trickled down his temple in the summer heat. He suspected Samuel with every fiber of his being, but like a man staring at the shadow of a hanged rope, knowing it's there but not seeing the rope itself. Turner could not claim what he couldn't yet touch. The pattern became undeniable with the third killing. In August, on another suffocatingly hot evening, 12-year-old Henry Lawson left the small-town schoolhouse after helping his teacher clean. He never arrived home. His body was found the following morning in the old barn behind the Miller property. Henry's fate bore similarities to Thomas and Abigail. Only this time, something new was added. A single crude carving ran across his chest, a wide, shallow curve etched deliberately into his skin. When the body was discovered, the sheriff stared long at that mark and knew instantly what he was looking at. It was a smile. That macabre symbol changed everything. Rumors had been swirling in town, but now they solidified. They weren't just facing a killer. They were facing one who wanted them to understand his calling card. The killings weren't merely for pleasure. They were theater. And Samuel Whitlock was the boy writing the script. When asked where he'd been that night, Samuel claimed to have been home with his mother. Martha Whitlock, hollow-eyed and drained of strength, confirmed his alibi. But the sheriff suspected her silence spoke of terror, not truth. Neighbors often spotted her standing on the porch in the days after Henry's murder, wringing her hands, a pale scowl carved into her face, her shoulders trembling when Samuel slipped out at night. She said nothing, yet her sunken eyes told everything. She feared her son, and perhaps she knew the horrors he carried in his smile. Yet again, Samuel walked free. With no proof, the law's hands remained tied, and his boldness only grew. By August's end, Brookhaven wasn't whispering anymore. The name Whitlock passed through parched lips in open disgust. Men spat when they spoke of him. Women pulled their children closer. Still, Samuel seemed to enjoy the scorn. He wandered town square more frequently, almost as if basking in the fire building around him. People swore he slowed his walk deliberately, ensuring his gaze lingered on every set of eyes brave enough to glance at him. Then came the moment that seared fear deeper into Brookhaven's conscience. One sweltering afternoon, Samuel strolled into the busy market with that unsettling calm. His smile widened as he passed through the crowd, his presence sucking the sound from the air until the chatter dulled to whispers. Then, in a voice soft yet sharpened enough to cut through the stillness, he said, "3, and counting." No one forgot those words, spoken casually like an observation, like he enjoyed reminding them all how helpless they were. Mothers clutched their children tighter. A butcher dropped his cleaver mid-cut, the blade thudding against the block. Samuel's grin flashed at them all before he vanished down the road, leaving silence like smoke after a flame. The sheriff's office boiled with demands. Fathers stormed the building, demanding justice. A preacher declared from the pulpit that Satan himself had rooted inside that boy. Yet Samuel was never taken in, never arrested. Turner feared it would shatter the fragile law of Brookhaven, because if Samuel were jailed without proof, some would storm the station to drag him out, and others would riot to demand blood. The law, thin as it was, had to hold, so Samuel roamed. And worse, he was learning. The gap between each killing shortened, the cruelty deepened, the staging more pronounced. Brookhaven no longer questioned if he would strike again, but when, and then came September. The late summer leaves began to curl brown. The heat remained, heavy and suffocating over the tattered landscape. Children had stopped playing entirely now. They stayed indoors, peering from windows, as though waiting for their names to be next. By then, Brookhaven had become a town orbiting one boy. Every decision, every fear, every prayer seemed to fold around Samuel Whitlock, and the grin that never faded. Even when he vanished into silence for days, the weight of him lingered, and when he resurfaced, he would leave another mark. The boy who smiled while killing was accelerating. And Brookhaven had only scratched the surface of the horror he was determined to unleash. By September, Brookhaven was no longer simply living in fear. It was beginning to fracture under the weight of it. Families who had lived side by side for generations now eyed one another with suspicion, as though betrayal and danger lurked not only in the boy with the smile, but in the silence of their neighbors. The murders of Thomas, Abigail, and Henry had reshaped daily life into a ritual of paranoia. Farmers no longer shouted greetings across fields. Men stopped gathering in taverns after long harvest days. Instead, every face seemed turned inward, every whisper sharper, every prayer more desperate. And at the center of every conversation was the same name, Samuel Whitlock. But the town could not agree on what to do. Some cried for his arrest, urging Sheriff Turner to take action despite the lack of evidence. Others demanded harsher measures, whispering of lynching, of chasing Samuel and his mother from Brookhaven, with fire and fists if need be. A smaller, quieter portion of the community cautioned restraint. They whispered that if Samuel were pushed, if the anger of the town exploded against him, his violence might escalate further. Turning a pattern of children's bodies into a massacre, none could stop. The sheriff listened to all of it and carried the burden heavily on his shoulders. He had no peace. At night, when others trembled in their homes, Turner sat on his porch with his revolver laid across his lap, staring into the dark fields, his mind shaking with the same question echoing across Brookhaven: when will he strike again? That question found its answer faster than they imagined. On the evening of September 10th, the Miller family prepared for supper inside their modest farmhouse at the edge of town. The meal had barely settled onto the table when their youngest, Clara, aged 10, failed to appear from where she'd been sent to gather water from the well. At first, her mother assumed she was stalling. Then minutes stretched into nearly half an hour. The food cooled untouched. Panic rose. Lanterns were lit. The search was swift, desperate, and tragically short. Clara's body was found just beyond the well, hidden in the tall grass, her white dress soaked crimson. And there, carved once again across her chest, lay the mark, a crude, wide smile etched by deliberate hands. This time, however, Samuel had not vanished unseen. Two teenage boys swore they'd spotted him only minutes before Clara disappeared. They had seen his thin figure tracing the edge of the Miller farm, his face lit by fading sun, his mouth curled in that unnerving grin. It wasn't proof, not enough to secure a trial. But in the minds of Brookhaven's people, it was undeniable confirmation of what they already believed. The town erupted. That night, dozens gathered outside the courthouse. Fathers with fists clenched, mothers with faces streaked in tears, young men with rifles thrown over their shoulders. The air was charged with fury, the crowd chanting Samuel's name like a curse, demanding the Sheriff Act. Some demanded the law. Most demanded blood. Inside his office, Sheriff Turner paced. He wanted nothing more than to lock Samuel in a cell and throw away the key, but he also knew the law as written offered him nothing to stand on. Arresting the boy without evidence would not hold in any court, and worse, it might feed his legend further, granting him the attention he seemed to crave. But then Turner considered the gravity of silence. If he did nothing, the townspeople might act on their own, forming a mob guided not by justice but by vengeance. And if Samuel got wind of their intent, there was no telling how the boy might retaliate. When he attempted to calm the crowd outside, his words fell into a storm. The law will prevail, he told them, sweat beading under his hat in the torchlight. But in return came angry shouts. The law is too slow. That boy is no longer one of us. How many more must die? It was not just Samuel dividing Brookhaven now. It was the very question of how justice should be carried out. Citizens began to split into factions, those who still clung to law, and those who believed law meant nothing in the face of evil. And Samuel, without lifting a finger, had managed to set brother against brother, father against neighbor. Meanwhile, Samuel himself seemed to feed off the chaos. 2 days after Clara Miller's funeral, he was seen at the market again. Standing silently by the well where women gathered, he tilted his head to watch them whisper. Then, as if mocking their grief, he placed 2 fingers to his lips and stretched them wider into a grotesque smile, the same smile carved into the bodies of his victims. The women gasped, clutching baskets to their chests, and fled. Samuel turned and walked away slowly, calmly, his shadow leaning long over the cobblestone path. He knew what he was doing. He wanted them afraid. They say evil often hides in shadows. But in Brookhaven, 1897, evil stood plainly in the sunlight, grinning, and the town, as divided as it was, would soon reach a breaking point. Because with each new body, Samuel wasn't only killing their children. He was killing their faith, in safety, in law, and in one another. The smile was spreading, and by October it would consume them all. October arrived with cooler air, but no reprieve for Brookhaven. Instead of harvest celebrations and evenings filled with fiddle music, the town slid deeper into fear. The murders had already taken 4 children. And with each funeral, the soil of Missouri seemed heavier, carrying not only the weight of the coffins, but the dread of what everyone believed was inevitable. Samuel would strike again, every creaking door at night, every crunch of footsteps in the dirt road, every scream of a nightbird sent shivers across back porches and candle-lit rooms. Families dared not gather after dark anymore. Even Sunday services grew thinner, as parishioners stayed huddled at home, as if the wooden walls of their farmhouses could keep the evil at bay. And yet Samuel appeared everywhere. Some mornings, he lingered at the edge of Main Street, leaning against a post as if he were simply another boy with nowhere to be. Other days he wandered near homes, watching through windows, standing in fields where children no longer dared to play. Wherever he appeared, that smile followed, mute, sharp as a blade, reminding them all how weak they were in the presence of their predator. Brookhaven was crumbling, and Samuel knew it. The next killing came with merciless swiftness. On the evening of October 14th, 13-year-old Ruth Callahan was sent to deliver bread to a neighbor. She never returned. By dawn, her lifeless body was discovered near the churchyard, placed in almost the exact same spot where Thomas Green had been found months earlier. The wounds were all too familiar, the carvings across her chest unmistakable. And this time something even more horrifying had been added. The bread she had once carried now lay beside her, sliced neatly into thin pieces, as though mocking the act of supper she would never share with her family again. It was not enough for Samuel to kill. He wanted the town to see his work, to recognize his hand in every detail. He wanted them to feel his presence even when he wasn't there. Sheriff Turner stood before Ruth's body longer than any man should. His weathered face was pale, streaked with sweat, his hand frozen at his revolver, though he knew it was too late to draw. For the first time, Turner understood the deeper truth. Samuel wasn't just committing murders. He was staging messages. Every crime scene was a communication, an escalation, a smiling dare carved into flesh. The sheriff gathered the townsfolk later that day in front of the courthouse. His voice cracked with fatigue but carried firmly. "I don't care if he's a boy. I don't care if the law says we can't hold him. We're out of time. If we do nothing, more of our children will die." But the sheriff's words were too late to unify the town. Half the men demanded Samuel be taken and executed without trial. Others insisted the law must be preserved, even while admitting their fear. Arguments nearly erupted into fists before Turner ended the gathering, his voice shaking as he promised, "If the law will not stop him soon, I will." That very night, Turner walked the outskirts of town, hoping to find Samuel, to corner him alone, away from his mother and away from the hands of a mob. And then he saw him. There, under the faint light of a fading moon, Samuel stood alone in the field outside the Miller home. His thin frame was shadowed, his head tilted. Turner gripped his revolver tightly, sweat dripping down his back despite the October chill. Slowly he approached, each crunch of grass louder in the silence. When the sheriff was close enough, Samuel turned. His grin cut across his pale face, as though illuminated all on its own. For a long moment neither spoke. Finally Turner aimed his revolver, hand trembling. Samuel tilted his head further, breaking into a slow, deliberate laugh. Soundless at first, then low and rasping, his shoulders quivering with the weight of mockery. Finally he said words Turner would never forget. "You're too late. You'll always be too late." With that, Samuel stepped back into the shadows of the field, vanishing into the night before Turner could force himself to fire. The sheriff knew then what the town had refused to accept. The killings would not stop until Samuel himself was stopped. And no trial, no prison, no sermon would end him. Only one thing would. Brookhaven was now living on the knife's edge. Parents did not allow children outside alone during daylight, let alone dusk. Men patrolled their own homes with shotguns at the ready. Women whispered about escaping the town altogether. Brookhaven was changing, becoming something darker. A place not just haunted by murder but consumed by it. And Samuel Whitlock, the boy no one dared touch, was orchestrating every note. By the end of October, Brookhaven would finally break. Not from grief, not from fear, but from rage. The town would stop whispering about Samuel Whitlock. They would come for him, but Samuel, always smiling, was waiting for exactly that. October's chill normally brought harvest celebration to Brookhaven, evenings of bonfires, cider, and fiddles playing deep into the night air. But in 1897, silence sat heavy where joy once lived. The town was trapped not by famine or fire, but by a single boy, Samuel Whitlock. His name carried like a curse whispered in the fields, his shadow stretching over every home, every prayer. Every sleepless night, after Ruth Callahan's death, Brookhaven was a powder keg waiting for a single spark. The people had buried too many children, and though no lawman or lawyer could lay official guilt on Samuel, everyone knew. They had seen the grin, felt his stare. They had heard the cryptic words he spat like poisoned seeds. 3, and counting. Now there were 4 dead, and that smile carved into the flesh of every victim made the connection undeniable. He wasn't hiding. He was daring them. The confrontation the sheriff feared was growing closer every day. The division widened in Brookhaven until families began to splinter along invisible lines. One group, fathers mostly, men who worked the fields with rough hands blistered from plows, grew militant. They gathered in barns at night, speaking in voices harsh with liquor and grief. They argued that the sheriff was weak, that waiting for evidence was as good as inviting death to every doorstep. "We have the proof we need," they barked to anyone listening. The boy smiles while our children rot. Others, still faithful to the law, warned against mob justice. They reminded the town of Missouri's reputation, of how quickly lynchings could spiral beyond control, of how violence rarely ended with just one victim. Yet even among the hesitant, fear pulled at their voices. They believed in the law, but even they whispered that perhaps Brookhaven's law wasn't strong enough to fight the kind of evil Samuel carried in his grin. Sheriff Elias Turner was caught in the center. Each day he carried the weight heavier, the look of a man nearing breaking point. He wanted nothing more than to put a bullet between Samuel's eyes, but the oath of his badge clashed with the desperation of his soul. Turner still remembered the boy's voice in the field, that mocking laughter under a silver moon, and the words that gnawed at him. "You'll always be too late." Now the sheriff feared Samuel wasn't simply killing, he was predicting. He was ahead of them, a step farther each time, smiling at their helplessness. By the second week of October, the whispers became plans. Bands of men began carrying weapons, not just at night but openly in daylight. Farmers arrived at Sunday service with shotguns balanced against the pews, daring Samuel to step foot inside. Boys young enough to have once played marbles in the streets now sat sharpening knives with hardened looks, mimicking the grim determination of their fathers. Mothers, on the other hand, gathered in desperate prayer circles. They begged Father O'Connell for guidance, but his sermons, once filled with hope, had grown darker, angrier. "Evil has come to Brookhaven," he thundered, his voice shaking through the rafters. "And if the hand of law cannot strike it down, then the hand of God must guide us to strike it ourselves." For some, that sounded like holy permission. For others, it was the first time the priest's voice carried more fear than faith. And Samuel, he stoked the fire. He knew exactly what was happening. Witnesses claimed to see him more boldly now. On cool afternoons, Samuel sat outside the general store, carving small pieces of wood into crude figurines with a pocket knife, his smile never fading. He left those little carvings behind deliberately, perched on steps or thrown into yards, most of them bearing the shape of a grotesque face, lips stretched ear to ear. A reminder, a signature, a promise. Children wept when they discovered one. Some refused to sleep in their rooms, begging to stay at their parents' sides, terrified of closing their eyes only to wake and find Samuel standing there. One morning, a family discovered a carving left on their porch. It was the shape of a small coffin, crudely made, the lid etched with that same wide smile. Their child, 10-year-old Mary, would go missing 3 days later. Her body was never found. That disappearance broke the dam. The town exploded. On October 20th, the men of Brookhaven gathered in the square for what they called justice, though it looked more like vengeance. Torches lit the air, rifles hunched against furious shoulders, and the crowd swelled with shouts that carried through every corner of town. Samuel Whitlock was not just under suspicion anymore. He was condemned. The sheriff faced them from the courthouse steps, his hand resting on the hilt of his revolver, his voice strained. "You can't take the law into your own hands," he pleaded, though even as he spoke his voice cracked, betraying that part of him which no longer believed his own words. But the men shouted back, "He's laughing at us." He's killing us, one child at a time. We'll hang him before the week is over. It was no longer a disagreement. It was war within the people of Brookhaven, and Samuel stood at the center, the eye of the storm, smiling silently as the town imploded around him. That very night, the mob marched toward the Whitlock farmhouse on the outskirts, torches in hand, rifles raised. The road was lined with frightened families who watched from porches torn between horror and grief as the crowd set out to kill a 14-year-old boy. Martha Whitlock had lived in misery long before Brookhaven turned against her. Tired, frail, worn by years of raising Samuel alone, she had defended him when forced, though with trembling lips and hollow eyes that betrayed the truth that she was terrified of her own son. Now staring out the cracked window of their farmhouse, lantern light falling across her anxious face, she knew what was coming. Samuel sat at the kitchen table in silence, half a loaf of bread unfinished at his side, idly running the edge of a knife across the table's surface. He hadn't asked about the noise outside. He hadn't asked about the gathering glow of torches in the distance. He simply smiled, dragging the steel slowly, deliberately into the wood, leaving deep scratches across its surface. His mother pleaded with him, her voice sharp with panic. "Samuel, you have to do something. You have to leave." He looked up, eyes glinting in the lamplight, his grin never faltering. "They'll come," he said softly. Then he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms like a guest awaiting company. "And I'll be ready." Martha's knees gave out where she stood. Her frail body collapsed to the floor as sobs escaped her chest. She begged him, begged her son to repent, to run, to give himself up. But Samuel only tilted his head, as if studying her like one of the animals he once cut open in secret. Then with a whisper he answered her cries, "I don't run. I smile." That night the mob surrounded the farmhouse. Torches hissed as their flames swayed in the cold wind. Boots and shouts trampled the silence. The voices rose in fury, chanting Samuel's name the way one calls out a monster in the woods, trying to frighten it into appearing. But Samuel did not peek out from the window. He did not cower. Instead, he stepped calmly out the front door, that pale, thin frame illuminated by orange fire. His lips etched with the infamous smile, his eyes gleaming like glass. He didn't flinch when rocks were thrown, when men shouted that the gallows were waiting, when rifles lifted in shaky hands. He just stood there, watching, grinning. The mob hesitated, just long enough for silence to spark doubt. For though every man despised him, though every woman wept for her lost children, the sight of a boy standing so calmly before death was enough to chill even vengeance. Samuel whispered something then, though few near the front heard it. His lips curled further and his voice hissed just above the crackle of torches. "You think this ends with me?" It slipped into the crowd like venom, seeding uncertainty where fury had lived, and in that pause Samuel smiled wider. The boy who had murdered their children now stood unconquered before them, unbroken by their rage, unafraid of their weapons, and slowly, Brookhaven realized the battle was no longer Samuel against the law, or Samuel against the people. It was Brookhaven against itself, and Samuel had already won. The October air was sharp, filled with smoke from the mob's torches. Brookhaven had reached the point of no return. What began as whispers over fences and muttered rumors in church pews had erupted into violence that no sheriff, no preacher, and no prayer could fully contain. The farmhouse of Samuel Whitlock stood like a crooked skeleton under the firelight, its wooden beams casting long shadows that stretched across the dirt. Men shouted curses, torches raised, their faces twisted with anger and grief. Women stood behind them, clutching shawls around their shoulders, some covering their eyes, others glaring at the boy who had stolen so many children from their arms. And then there he was. Samuel's small figure emerged through the front door with unnerving calm, framed by orange light that danced against his pale face. He didn't run. He didn't plead. He stepped onto the porch as though he had been waiting all along. His lips parted into that signature grin, wide, sharp, unshaken. For a moment even the angriest among the crowd faltered, because there stood not a monster, not a beast man, but a boy. A boy who looked death in the eye without fear. The silence was unbearable. The flames hissed. The voices of the mob dimmed into the sound of their own hard breathing. Samuel tilted his head, narrow shoulders rising and falling in the faintest laugh, though no sound left his throat. It was enough to break their steadiness. One of the men shouted, "Hang him!" Another called out, "Kill him here and now!" And the torches surged forward, fists rising against the boy. But Samuel did not flinch. He stepped off the porch and into the circle of firelight. His eyes scanned every face in the crowd, resting on the fathers of the children he had killed, on the women still drenched in mourning. Then he spoke. "You'll never forget me." The words were not yelled. They were quiet, deliberate, yet they struck through the group like a crack of thunder. Samuel's voice carried with lethal calm, his grin curling larger as he spoke again. "You think this will end when I swing from a rope? No, you'll see me every night. In your houses, in your barns, in your prayers." His head tilted further, the shadows carving his features into something almost inhuman. "Even if I die now, I already live here." He tapped his finger against his temple. "In your thoughts, in your fears. I've won. It was madness. It was brilliance." The mob, already unsteady, began to fracture in that moment. Some lunged forward in fury, only to be restrained by others shaken by his words. Torches waved chaotically. Rifles trembled in uncertain hands. The sheriff shouted for order, his voice breaking against the storm. "Stop this now! Stop!" But Brookhaven was no longer just against Samuel. Brookhaven had turned against itself. The first act of violence didn't come from Samuel. It came from the crowd. One man, drunk on grief and rage, fired his rifle into the night sky and screamed, "If Turner won't hang him, then we will." Another man argued back, "And let his blood curse this town? You'll drag us all to hell with you." Shouts turned to shoves. Shoves turned to fists. And then, under the glow of firelight, Brookhaven boiled into chaos. Neighbors brawled openly in the dirt yard of the Whitlock farmhouse. Old alliances snapped like dry twigs. The mob, so unified in its fury, now tore itself apart in front of the boy who only smiled wider, watching them descend into madness. His grin split white through the dark, like a blade flashing against the flames. Sheriff Turner struggled to hold order, slamming the butt of his revolver into the dirt and shouting over the chaos, but no one listened. His throat seared raw, his authority drowned beneath the roar of grief and violence. And through it all, Samuel stood untouched, the chaos swirling around him as though he were the conductor of a symphony only he understood. Martha Whitlock screamed from the porch, her frail body trembling as she pleaded for the men to leave. But even her voice faded under the brawl, swallowed by fists and curses. And then, as fights boiled and rifles wavered, came the moment of horror. A gun fired. Not into the air this time. The shot cracked through the crowd, echoing across the fields. Gasps split the mob as a man stumbled backward, clutching his chest before collapsing into the dirt. A father of three, not killed by Samuel, killed by Brookhaven's own fury. The shouting escalated into outright panic. More shots rang out. Men tackled one another. A torch was thrown, smashing against the farmhouse wall, flames licking hungrily up the dry wood. Mothers screamed, scrambling to pull their husbands out of the frenzy. The sheriff, choking on smoke and fear, darted into the chaos and wrapped his hands around Samuel's thin arm, dragging him backward from the burning farmhouse. Turner pulled him into the night, his grip iron around the boy's wrist. Samuel's face tilted upward toward him, that same insufferable grin twisting his lips in calm delight. "You see," Samuel whispered, his words cutting through the hammering noise. "I don't need to kill them. They'll do it for me." Turner's stomach turned to stone. For the first time, he felt not like a man pursuing a murderer, but like a pawn caught in a boy's game. The mob scattered as the fire consumed the Whitlock farmhouse, flames roaring like an omen. The crowd carried the dead father into town, their anger shattered not by Samuel's survival, but by the realization of what they had become. By the time dawn rose, Brookhaven lay splintered. Men bore cuts and bruises from neighbors they once trusted. The sheriff's authority was nothing but ash. The farmhouse was ruins, its skeleton smoking in the wind, and Samuel, despite it all, had survived. That day, some swore they saw him walking back into town alongside the sheriff, his hands free, his pace slow and calm. His lips stretched into the widest smile yet, one that seemed to say, "I didn't need to fight. You destroyed yourselves for me." Brookhaven would never recover from that night. Relationships had been broken. Faith had faltered. And now more than ever, the town realized the truth. Samuel Whitlock's power wasn't only in the blood he spilled, it was in the fear he grew. And as October turned deadly colder, still more blood would come, because Samuel was far from finished. The morning after the fire, Brookhaven awoke to smoke still rising from the ruins of the Whitlock farmhouse. The stench of charred wood clung heavy in the air, mingling with the sour fragments of guilt and violence from the night before. The mob that sought justice had left destruction in its wake, yet justice itself had slipped further away. Samuel hadn't been hanged. He hadn't been exiled. Instead, he returned to town under the escort of Sheriff Elias Turner, walking through the dirt streets with his hands free, his thin chest rising steady, his face carved into that eternal smile. He looked less like a boy brought to answer for death, and more like a conquering king returning from war, a victor who hadn't lifted a weapon, yet had left a trail of ruin behind him. The townsfolk fell silent as he passed. Some spat into the dirt, some clutched children against their skirts. Many simply turned their faces, ashamed of what they had done, and terrified of what Samuel would do next. Turner marched him to the jailhouse, every bootstep heavy, every glance at the boy beside him weighing on his soul. He slammed the barred door shut, locking Samuel in, though even that action gave no relief. The boy's grin only widened as he sat cross-legged on the wooden bunk, leaning back against the wall as though this was nothing more than another step in his game. That expression gnawed at Turner throughout the day. He tried paperwork, tried pouring stiff coffee, tried to steady his breath, but each time he looked through the bars, Samuel was there, eyes gleaming, grin undiminished. Finally, as the sun dipped low, the sheriff stepped forward and said the words he had carried too long in silence. "Why, Samuel? Why them? Why the children?" At first, Samuel didn't answer. He toyed with a piece of straw between his fingers, gaze unfocused. Then he tilted his head sideways, lips curling higher. "Because they scream better." His answer, flat and lifeless, carved ice down Turner's spine. Samuel continued after a beat. "Adults fight. They make noise. They resist. But children..." He let the grin take its full shape before whispering, "Children give fear honestly." Turner slammed his hand against the bars, rattling the cell door with sudden fury. "You're nothing but a coward hiding behind smiles." Samuel's gaze narrowed slightly, though the grin did not fade. "And yet, Sheriff, I'm the one who decides who sleeps tonight and who doesn't wake up." His voice lowered into something sharper. "You can't stop me. None of you can. That's why you burn your own houses down before you touch me. That's why you fight each other." The sheriff turned away, jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. It was true. Brookhaven was unraveling. The boy who should have been powerless stood at its center like a puppeteer. That evening, Turner sat alone in his office long after the lamps dimmed. The town was broken, his authority shredded, and more innocent lives would soon follow if he did nothing. He knew it now fully. Samuel would kill again, not because he wanted to hide or survive, but because he wanted the act itself. Killing was not his secret. It was his language. His smile, his mark carved into flesh, his taunts in broad daylight. They were his way of speaking to the town. And Brookhaven had heard him loud and clear. The law no longer mattered. Samuel had no fear of courts, no shame for his crimes. The sheriff himself had heard what he admitted in that cell, not even as a confession, but a boast. Turner gripped the revolver laid across his desk, hand trembling. He had dedicated his life to upholding the law. But now the law stood between Brookhaven's children and a monster who didn't hide the blood on his hands. For the first time since donning the badge, Turner considered becoming executioner instead of protector. He imagined walking back into that cell, lifting the revolver, placing the muzzle against Samuel's head, and ending the nightmare with one pull of the trigger. Quick, final. The smile gone forever, but his hand froze each time it inched toward the gun. Because though the urge screamed in his chest, there was something else gnawing deeper. Fear. Not fear of killing, no. Fear of what that boy would do in his final moments. Would Samuel laugh at him as the bullet left the chamber? Would his last glance prove him right, that even in death he had already won? Elias Turner felt himself shrinking under the shadow of a 14-year-old boy. Meanwhile, the people of Brookhaven didn't sleep. Fathers paced floors with rifles tense in hand. Mothers clutched children to their sides. Neighbors avoided one another, each privately swallowing dread. The mob's failed justice had only worsened matters. They had not destroyed the evil. They had fed it, letting Samuel relish in both the fire and the division. Whispers spread that locking him behind iron would not hold him, that the grin would find a way to slip through bars, that someone else's child would be next, no matter how many locks and rifles stood guard. One woman, Mrs. Dowell, the same who once confronted Samuel in public, stormed to the sheriff's office under moonlight, demanding to see him. She slammed her palms against Turner's desk, eyes wide with desperation. "You kill him, Sheriff. If the law won't allow it, break the law. For God's sake, do it before another grave is dug." Her words carried the weight of every mother in Brookhaven. Turner swallowed hard, unable to look her squarely in the eyes, because he wanted to. More than anything, he wanted to. But still his finger shook away from the revolver's trigger. Samuel's smile haunted him, a reminder of how deeply the boy had taken root in his mind. On the third day behind bars, Samuel acted. In the early morning, as Turner unlocked the office door, he heard humming. Low, steady, sharp as a razor under breath. Samuel sat in the cell, knees bent, tapping a rhythm against the floorboards with his heel. The tune was faint but recognizable. It was the simple melody sung at Brookhaven funerals. The hymn every grieving family had heard as small coffins lowered into the ground. Turner froze as it echoed. Every note was struck with icy precision, and through it all that grin stretched over Samuel's face. "Do you hear them crying, Sheriff?" Samuel asked softly, his tone like silk sliding over broken glass. "They'll cry again soon." The sheriff's breath snapped heavy. With one step he crossed the room, fists wrapped around the bars. "Not if I put you in the ground first." "Then do it," Samuel whispered, leaning forward until his eyes gleamed inches away. "But when you pull the trigger, ask yourself, did you kill me to save them or to save yourself from me?" The words dug deep. Turner stumbled back, revolver half drawn, and stopped again. Samuel leaned against the wall, humming once more, the grin carved so deep it might as well have been branded onto his face. That night, Turner sat again, staring at his revolver, the weight heavier than steel. He could end it. One bullet, silence at last. But another voice gnawed through his mind, Samuel's voice. "Even if I die now, I already live here," and Turner began to fear the truth. That Samuel was right. Killing him might not end the horror. Killing him might only make the smile eternal. Brookhaven continued to fracture. Some demanded Samuel's death. Others claimed killing him would curse the town forever. Families turned against one another, more divided than at any point before. All while Samuel lay in wait, humming his funeral tune, smiling at the bars that should have made him powerless, but only seemed to make him stronger. The sheriff stood at his breaking point. The choice was no longer between law and justice. It was between sanity and surrender. Between the badge and the gun, and soon Elias Turner would decide. The cell door rattled in the night as Samuel shifted on his bunk, humming the same funeral hymn that had tormented the sheriff for days. The sound carried through the narrow jailhouse, threading into the silence of Brookhaven like a poisoned lullaby. No one slept anymore. Even those who didn't hear the hymn swore they felt it, an echo of death moving in the air. Sheriff Elias Turner sat in his office, hat off, head bowed low, revolver on the desk before him. The lamplight flickered against the walls, painting long shadows like bars across the wood. His eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights, his mind torn between duty and desperation. The boy had broken him, not with fists, not with knives, but with words, with smiles, with the certainty of coming death. The people of Brookhaven had stopped speaking about if Samuel would kill again. They spoke only of when and who. Mothers clutched their children closer than ever. Fathers kept weapons cocked and polished, but there was no peace to be found. The town had already lost 5 lives, maybe more, and each morning arrived with the same question: who would be next? Turner could feel it in his bones. If Samuel remained alive, another coffin would soon join the others. But still, the sheriff hesitated. On the 4th night of Samuel's imprisonment, Turner awoke from a dreamless half-sleep at his desk to a sound that froze the blood in his veins. Laughter. It was soft at first, drifting from the cell like a chill breeze. But it thickened, grew sharper, filled with something guttural that rattled in the throat of the boy behind bars. It wasn't joyous laughter. It was cruel, deliberate, mocking, the sound of someone savoring the unraveling of another man's mind. Turner gripped his revolver, stumbling to his feet, slamming the office door open. Samuel sat upright on the bunk, shoulders shaking in mirth, his grin so wide it looked carved into flesh. "What are you laughing at?" Turner demanded, voice cracking. Samuel dragged his hand across his mouth, barely stifling his chuckles before replying in a voice low and venomous, "At you." He leaned forward, his face pressed close to the bars. "You sit here night after night, revolver always by your hand, whispering to yourself that you'll end me. But you won't. You can't. Because deep down you know, even if this body dies, I've already planted myself in you." "Stop!" Turner snapped, slamming the butt of his gun against the bars. "Just stop." But Samuel's smile only widened. "Tell me, Sheriff, how many times have you pictured pulling that trigger? How many times have you seen my blood on your hands?" His voice dropped almost to a hiss. "And tell me, why does that thought make you smile too?" Turner staggered back, chest heavy, revolver clenched until his knuckles whitened. His heart thundered because in the depths of his conscience, Samuel's words held a sickening truth. Part of him did want it. Part of him longed to watch the boy's grin disappear under the weight of a bullet, and Samuel knew it. He could see it gleaming in Turner's eyes. At dawn, the sheriff left the jailhouse for the first time in days. He walked through Brookhaven's dirt streets, each home shuttered, smoke limp from chimneys, silence hanging like a noose. A few faces peeked from behind curtains, hollow, tired, hopeless. The men no longer asked if. They asked only when Turner would finally kill the boy. By midday, Elias gathered the town in front of the courthouse. His voice cracked at first, but steadied as he spoke. "You put your trust in me as sheriff. You gave me this badge, believing I would protect you. But I haven't protected anything. 5 children are dead, families torn apart, and fear has corroded every one of us. The law hasn't worked. I know it, and you know it. And it won't work on him. He doesn't live by it, and he'll never die by it. So I stand here before you now, ready to do what must be done." Whispers spread across the crowd. Mothers clutched each other for support. Fathers nodded grimly. The preacher closed his eyes, whispering a prayer under his breath. "For Brookhaven to survive," Turner continued, voice thunderous, "Samuel Whitlock must be ended." "By my hand," the crowd roared approval. And for the first time in months there was unity. That night Turner prepared himself. Alone in his office, he polished the revolver as if it were more than metal, as if it were salvation. His reflection in the steel chamber looked older, weaker but determined nonetheless. His hand hovered steady now, no longer trembling. When the hour deepened and the streets were empty, Turner unlocked the jailhouse door, boots heavy against the floorboards. Samuel sat awake, smiling still, as if he expected it. The sheriff raised the gun. "It ends tonight," he said firmly, though a crack split his voice. Samuel leaned forward on his bunk, hands dangling freely between his knees, grin bright in the dim light. "Then do it. Prove them wrong. Show them you're more like me than you think." "Shut your mouth," Turner barked, steel shaking in his grip. Samuel ignored him, rising slowly, his thin frame weaving through light and shadow. He stepped so close his breath fogged the metal of the revolver. His smile was endless. "Go ahead, kill me. But when you do, Sheriff, ask yourself, whose smile will they fear more in Brookhaven, mine or yours?" The sheriff's finger curled against the trigger. Time slowed. Heat rose to his brow. Breath tore from his lungs, his soul choking under weight too great to bear. And in that instant Turner realized the real horror. Samuel had no fear of dying. Death itself was simply part of his design, another way to spread his smile through the town forever. If Turner pulled the trigger now, every grave in Brookhaven would be haunted by more than a boy's grin. It would be haunted by the echo of a lawman who became judge, jury and executioner. Turner wrestled with it for what felt like hours. Revolver steady, Samuel smiling, the silence suffocating between them. Finally his hand fell. He lowered the gun, breath shattering from his chest. "I won't give you that victory," he whispered. Samuel's smile never faded. If anything, it grew wider. "Then the killings will go on," he said softly. The sheriff knew he was right. Brookhaven drifted deeper into despair in the days that followed. The sheriff's hesitation split the community again, some furious he hadn't killed the boy, others clinging to him as the last tether to the idea of law. And Samuel remained in his cell, humming, grinning, a ghost in the shape of a boy waiting for whichever side would break first. All roads were closing now. Either Turner would kill him, or Samuel would kill again. And in the closing days of 1897, the brutal truth would finally arrive, ending the standoff and settling the fate of Brookhaven once and for all. The winter winds of late 1897 cut through Brookhaven with a bitterness that matched the spirit of the town. Days were shorter, nights longer, and the chilling silence weighed heavier than ever. The streets that once rang with the laughter of playing children now carried only the hollow sound of wind passing through shuttered homes. Brookhaven was a town strangled by fear, its heartbeat slowed to near death, and still, Samuel Whitlock smiled. Behind the bars of the jailhouse, his grin persisted unchanged through fire, mobs, and the sheriff's revolver nearly pressed to his forehead. He was the boy who had taken 5 children, perhaps more, and yet seemed untouchable. His smile had become Brookhaven's curse, painted not only on his own lips, but etched into the hearts of every man, woman, and child who dreamed of him at night. By December, the town had reached its end. Something had to break. On the morning of December 2nd, Brookhaven woke to screams. Their mother, Mrs. Monroe, who had already buried her daughter Abigail months earlier, found her youngest son missing from his bed. The sheets were cold. His shoes were gone. By the time the town gathered for search, it was already too late. The boy's body was found hanging from an oak tree just outside the churchyard. His throat was slashed, and across his chest, yet again, the crude, deliberate carving of a smile. But this time something new sent horror through every mourner. Carved above the smile was a word: Turner. The sheriff stared at the body until his knees nearly buckled beneath him. His name. Samuel hadn't just killed another child. He had sent a message. The killings would not stop. Not until the sheriff broke completely. The whispers began immediately. He's killing from inside the jail. Others are helping him. He's corrupted the law. Turner's too weak to stop him. Whatever the truth, one reality became clear. Samuel was no longer contained by those iron bars. Prison only gave him a throne from which to torment. That night the townsfolk gathered again, wielding torches and fury. They no longer demanded justice. They demanded vengeance. And this time, not even Sheriff Turner could protect the boy. The jailhouse stood surrounded. Angry voices pounded against the wooden walls, fists battering the doors. Turner stepped outside to meet them, revolver drawn, his face hollow, weary beyond his years. "This ends tonight," one man shouted. "Either we hang him or the whole town burns." Turner raised the gun high, firing a shot straight into the air. Silence rang sharp through the crowd as men froze, torches flickering, rifles shaking. The sheriff's voice cracked but carried. "No one moves, not until I do what I should have done weeks ago." The voices rippled into uneasy quiet. Mothers pulled their shawls tighter. Fathers exchanged hard glances, but none stepped forward. Turner had declared his decision, and by the grim finality in his voice, everyone understood. The lawman's rope was breaking. He entered the jailhouse, boots thudding heavy across wooden planks, the revolver clutched steady at last. Samuel was waiting. As always, the boy sat cross-legged on the bunk, arms resting lazily on his knees, eyes locked with amusement. His grin was brighter than the lamplight, a slash of pale defiance in the shadows. "I wondered how long it would take you," Samuel whispered, voice as steady as ever. "Are you ready to smile like me, Sheriff?" Turner stepped closer, raising the gun. "You wrote my name on his chest. That ends tonight." Samuel tilted his head, that grin splitting wide. "Then you understand. You and I are the same. You'll pull the trigger, and when you do, you'll feel it. The heat, the power, the hunger you've buried your whole life. It'll finally breathe. And when Brookhaven looks at you, it won't see a lawman anymore. It'll see me. Enough." Turner roared, pressing the muzzle of the revolver against the boy's temple. Samuel didn't flinch. He only leaned into it, lips curling higher, eyes gleaming like shards of cold glass. "Do it," Samuel whispered. "I want to hear the sound." For a long, suffocating moment, the jail lay silent. The sheriff's breath rasped. His finger coiled around the trigger. The boy waited, smiling. Then with a deafening crack, the gun fired. The bullet seared into Samuel's skull, his body jerking once before slumping sideways on the bunk. Blood streaked the bed frame, pooling thick on the floor. His eyes stared glassy toward the ceiling, that smile, impossibly, disturbingly, still etched faint across his lips. Turner staggered back, revolver trembling in his hand, chest heavy with both relief and horror. The deed was done. The boy was dead. The nightmare ended, but was it? When Turner stepped outside, revolver still slick in his grip, the crowd fell silent. They didn't cheer. They didn't cry. They stared wide-eyed, holding torches that crackled in the frozen air, confronted not with victory but with a darker truth. Justice hadn't saved Brookhaven. Justice had never been possible. Samuel Whitlock was gone, yet his presence lingered. His murders had claimed their children. His games had poisoned their town. His smile, unyielding even in death, had carved itself into the marrow of Brookhaven's bones. The sheriff looked over the townsfolk, seeing their wary eyes, their silence, their fear. And in that silence, he understood Samuel's most horrifying victory. His death wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of legend. The boy who smiled while killing would forever haunt Brookhaven, no longer in flesh, but in memory. In the years that followed, whispers persisted. Some swore they could still hear the funeral hymn humming softly on cold nights. Others claimed to glimpse a grin in the shadows of barns, or in reflections on darkened windows. Mothers told their children to come inside before sundown, not because of wolves or strangers, but because of Samuel. The graves of Thomas Green, Abigail Monroe, Henry Lawson, Clara Miller, Ruth Callahan, and young Jacob Monroe stood as eternal reminders of the year Brookhaven lost its innocence. And Samuel's grave, unmarked and buried far outside town, never grew grass. Only weeds curled there, bending against the Missouri wind. Sheriff Elias Turner never wore his badge the same again. He fulfilled his duty, yes, but the haunted look in his eyes told everyone the truth. When he pulled the trigger that night, a part of Samuel had entered him too. Like poison in the blood, lingering, and so the story of Samuel Whitlock became more than crime, more than murder. It became a myth, a legend whispered across generations. The boy who smiled while killing, a boy whose grin outlived him, a boy whose shadow never faded, a boy who left Brookhaven forever broken. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.